Professora Cláudia, the floor is yours. Professora Cláudia Medeiros, you're unmute.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Vera. I need you to let me show my screen. I'm sorry. I'll continue speaking, okay? Good morning, everyone. Mustafa, I think you were holding the video. Well, welcome to this webinar on certification of repositories. And my name is Claudia Bauzer Medeiros, and I'm going to be your co-host together with the other institutions and experts who are co-hosting this event, namely World Data System, Academia Brasileira de Ciências, the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, and Research Data Alliance. And today's topic is a very exciting and important topic around scientific data management, which is a certification of scientific data repositories. Please, for all of you who are watching live on YouTube, send comments and questions to eScience@fapesp.br. All of your questions will be answered either live or afterwards by email. And you can send the questions in Portuguese or English. And if you want to send questions afterwards, you are also very welcome. Just a couple of announcements. First of all, even though FAPESP does not require deposit data on certified repositories, you will all see throughout this event that certification is really important because it requires good data management practices that all of us have to learn more about and practice. And there are many kinds of repository certification, and most important of all, certification fosters trust, which is a keyword that will underlie all of the presentations today. Briefly, this is going to be divided in blocks of presentations. In the beginning, Rorie and Dawei will talk about why certification and why it's important. And then John will come and talk about how, for a specific kind of certification process called TrustSeal. Then we'll have questions and answers. And the second part will again go to why and how with Ingrid, Mustafa, and a wrap up. So I welcome you, and I would like to send the microphone to Rorie, who is the acting executive director of WDS, and he's going to be one of the other people who are going to co-conduct today. Rorie is speaking from Japan, and he knows a lot about certification. So thank you, Rorie, for sharing your knowledge with us, and I pass the microphone and the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. So it's my absolute pleasure to speak with you today. So I'm going to sort of give you a good, what I hope is background to the rest of the talks today. So a good foundation and really focus on why we want to talk about trustworthy data repositories. As Claudia said, I'm currently the acting executive director of the World Data System, and I'm also head of the TrustSeal Secretariat. So let me begin by making it very, very clear that, that trust is at the very heart of storing and sharing data. So from a data funder perspective, they want reassurances their investment in the production of research data is not wasted, but will remain into the future, whilst data reuse will obviously give them a higher return on their investment. Data depositors want to be sure that their data is safe and remain accessible, usable, and meaningful over time. And data users want to know that data have been preserved properly and are of high quality. So to sort of evaluate the trustworthiness of data repositories, this has been answered through the creation of several certification services. And the one we're really going to focus on today, and I will mention all of them in a moment, is the most lightweight and the most popular, and it's called the Core TrustSeal. And this was actually developed by a partnership working group under the Research Data Alliance between the Data Seal of Approval and the World Data System of the International Science Council. And just to explain why this is sort of important to the World Data System, so our mission is to promote free and open access to high quality scientific data that are managed for the long term. And you can think of WDS as a collaborative community of trustworthy data repositories, or what are shortened to TDRs. And member organizations of the World Data System, they hold and serve data or data products across all the scientific fields. And basically, WDS coordinates their activity to achieve a larger capacity than that of the individual members. And WDS builds up connections between the scientific research community and trustworthy data repositories, such that researchers have access and use of historical data, and they can make sure that they preserve their research outputs for the future, for future generations. So sort of how does the member accreditation work within WDS? Well, WDS regular members, which are the main type of member, they're data centers or data analysis services, they actually undergo the Core TrustSeal certification as part of their accreditation process of joining the World Data System. And I wanted to also mention here that for a data repository that isn't at the level maybe already yet to become a regular member, we also have introduced this idea of a candidate member. And these are organizations who would like to become a regular member in the future, but they may not have all of the necessary processes and documentation in place at this moment to undergo Core TrustSeal certification. So the point is that candidate members have the opportunity to develop their responses to the Core TrustSeal certification with the help of WDS and its membership. So that's sort of a brief idea of why this is important to the World Data System. So going to sort of the main part of what I want to talk with you today, I thought it was good to really sort of start by saying, what do we mean by a repository? And there's quite a formal definition at the top there. Repositories preserve, manage, and provide access to digital materials in a variety of formats. These materials are curated to enable search, discovery, and reuse. There must be sufficient control for the digital materials to be authentic, reliable, accessible, and usable on a continuing basis. What we really mean by that is repositories take responsibility for the management of your data, and they ensure that they are held in an appropriate environment for an appropriate period of time. And repositories really fall into two main types, and the type we're really going to be focusing on today mainly is what we call domain repositories. So these are subject-based repositories, so they specialize in a specific research field or a specific data type, and normally have a well-defined group of users, what we call the designated community. Often, many domain repositories will have a national or a regional remit, and they may also be part of a wider network or subject to international agreements regarding data sharing and management. So, for example, if you were talking about Antarctic data, would be a very good exemplar of this. The other type, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, are what we term generalist repositories. And these are really more generic multi-subject repositories. And typical examples might be an institutional repository, such as a university library, or an open access repository, such as Zenodo. And the user community in this case is likely to be very broad. It may even be all of the general public. But general repositories often rely on the data depositors to actually manage their own data. And they only really offer fairly simple archiving, so static long-term preservation. They don't necessarily manage it beyond keep giving you a storage area. Some, especially institutional repositories, may offer sort of a minimum curation expertise to help with generating basic metadata, so information, data on the data. So why is it important to choose the right repository? Why is it important? Why is repository selection important? Well, I hope you would agree that your research data are valuable to you, but they're not only valuable to you, they're also valuable to others too. And proper management and storage of your data are vital to ensure their safeguarding such that they remain accessible, unchanged over time, and of a high quality as possible. And as I've already mentioned, funders are increasingly mandating that the data they fund, your data, are openly shared and are preserved for the long term, such that their investment in the production is not wasted and they achieve their highest return on the investment. This is important, which is why I've reiterated it here. And the role of the repository in the data lifecycle should not be underestimated. A good repository will not only increase the adherence of your data to the FAIR principles. So this is a term that's increasingly used in the community, talking about findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And it will also ensure that your data remain fair over time. And therefore, the selection of the right repository is essential. And here we're really, again, thinking about what we would call trustworthy data repositories. So certification standards, and I'll again show you those in a second, they play an important role in establishing trust. And by doing so, they really sustain the opportunities for long-term data sharing. And these standards, they look at the technical infrastructure as one would expect, but they also look at organizational aspects, financial aspects, staffing aspects, legal aspects, workflows, risk management. They basically ensure that the systems that within the data repository operate according to their objectives and specifications. The data sets that they hold are complete and exclude any unintended modifications. The data sets actually contain what they claim to contain. So again, we're talking about metadata, data on about data, and data and services are accessible and usable. And as we speak, there are sort of three main certification procedures or standards that now exist, and these sort of build upon each other, forming a certification framework. So I've already mentioned the core TrustSeal. This is really at the foundational level, the core level, what we call core certification. And this came from more sort of community-based norms, which were granted to data repositories who originally obtained the Data Seal of Approval or WDS membership, as I mentioned in my introduction. And as I also said, it's fairly lightweight. So we're talking about 16 requirements. So you can see why this is a sort of the initial level we're talking about. And then building upon that, and it should be, and again, it should be made clear that any effort that's put into the lowest level will help you move up the levels. So it's not that these things are done in isolation, but if you move up to the next level, that's what we call extended certification. And that's embodied by what's known as the Nestor seal. So it's granted to repositories that perform a structured, externally reviewed, publicly available self-audit based on a German DIN standard 31644, and again, it's also known as the Nestor seal. So here you can see the number of criteria have pretty much doubled. And then right at the top level, we have a full ISO standard. So ISO 16363, this is really a formal certification. It's highly demanding. It involves a full external audit and certification based on the ISO standard. And here we're talking about over 100 metrics. So really, it's a big step change. The first two, there's just an application process. Here, the repository not only has to undergo the application, but also has people come in and look at their processes and make sure that the repository is doing what it says it's doing. So here's a list of the potential benefits of a trustworthy data repository to a data producer or depositor. So I hope that some of these will sort of speak to you and make sense to you. So the first is really that your data management plan will be fulfilled, so you can satisfy funder open data requirements. Again, the initial investment in collecting your data is preserved. You have the satisfaction that your data are being stewarded correctly and remain useful and meaningful. The data are looked after in the long term, even if the service discontinues, and that will be explained to you as we move through the talks. The ease of discovery of your data is increased. Publication, reuse, or repurposing and citation is made easier for your data. There's recognized expertise available to assist you with any technical issues. And it can be ensured that any necessary wanted conditions on access and use, as well as licensing, are adhered to, which, as you can imagine, is particularly important for sensitive data. And if you're a data user, well, there's a number of benefits for you too. You can easily discover data. You can easily understand how to access your access rights and your usage rights. You can reuse, repurpose the data without the cost of actually going out and collecting, producing it. You can verify and thus build on other results, which accelerates scientific knowledge. You can cite your peers, knowing that the data will still exist in the future. You have the satisfaction that the data are original and corrupted, or that any changes that have happened are actually recorded as what we know is called provenance. And that reuse of the data is made easier through full appropriate metadata in an international community standard. And you also have the ability quite often to give feedback to the data producer holder. So there's really a large number of benefits when you start talking about the importance of trustworthy data repositories. So the second half of my talk is really going to just give you a quick overview of some of the ways that you might go about locating a trustworthy data repository. So I'm just very, very briefly going to show you the following. So the core TrustSeal website, the World Data System website, what's known as 33data.org, the repository finder, and fairsharing.org. So first things first, of course, if you want to find out about trustworthy certified data repositories, then you can go directly to the source. And the source in this case is the core TrustSeal website, which has a search page that lists all of the certified repositories, not only the ones that are core TrustSeal certified, but the ones that are also transitioning from the WDS certification or the Data Seal of Approval certification. So you can please go and explore that. The URL is at the bottom of the screen. You can also look for WDS regular members. So WDS regular members will be a subset of the core TrustSeal repositories. Not every core TrustSeal certified repository is a WDS member, but all WDS members either are or will be soon core TrustSeal certified. So they're either already certified as core TrustSeal or transitioning from the old previous WDS membership. And the important thing here is that these repositories will also have a mandate as regards open data, so making data openly freely accessible. So this is an important consideration if that is a requirement that you're interested in. Then we move to Re3Data, which is the Registry of Research Data Repositories, and this is managed under DataCite. It actually contains, I think, currently about 2,500 entries so that you can search through. And it has actually a very useful, easy way of visualizing important aspects of the repositories via a subset of symbols. And these symbols, I'll give you an example in a minute, but these symbols show that whether any additional information is available on that repository, whether the data are open access, it gives you information on terms of usage and licensing, whether permanent identifiers or persistent identifiers, PIDs, are used. So here we're talking about things like ORCIDs, which are persistent identifiers for people, or, for example, a digital object identifier, which is a sort of permanent persistent identifier for the data or for a publication. And also, and very importantly in this case, whether it's certified. So if you go to that URL, this is what you see, is the Re3 Data website, and you've got a few options there to just perform a search immediately or browse and a few other options. And this, if you perform a search, and you can even perform a blank search and get everything, this is the sort of thing you see. So you start getting entries of each of the data repositories. And very importantly, you get an option to filter by certificates. So this is, so in the future, this will really differentiate between the two. At the moment, the Re3 Data mixes both certifications and kind of more community standards, and those things are a little bit different. But at the moment, they're listed under certificates as one general category. However, in the future, it will be those two categories will actually be separated to make it much clearer which are certified not only by TrustSeal, but the Nestor Seal and ISO 16363. And also which are sort of recommended under different community standards. And if you go into a particular entry itself, you'll see that you have a little red mark, and that easily indicates that this has a certification, and it tells you what the certification is. It tells you that in this case, it's certified by the TrustSeal. This is quite a cool thing that I wish I probably would have liked to have demoed. It's not not vital as regards the talk on trustworthy data repositories, but if you use the browse functionality, there is really quite a cool thing where you can browse by topic or browse by country, I think, or browse by, I can't remember what the other category is. But here is kind of like a wheel that you can click on, and it zooms in and out to sort of narrow your choices down to the type of repositories that you're interested in. So next we move to the repository finder. Now this currently exists, but ultimately will be made a bit more holistic. It will be added more generally to the DataSite Commons alongside the Re3 data. But at the moment, I think it's worth showing you because it's a quite nice sort of front end to Re3 data. So this really offers you a quick way to retrieve results for meeting the criteria recommended by the Enabling Fair Data Project in the US or the FAIRS Fair project in Europe. So for example, for the Enabling FAIRS Fair project, the results consist of repositories used by the Earth, Space, Environmental Sciences community that provide open access to data and use persistent identifiers. And the searching in both cases is based on criteria to ensure the most relevant up-to-date results are given. And this means that you can really extend the search functionality to other criteria that, say, a publisher or a funder might be interested in to help find an appropriate repository. So that's a very quick look at the homepage. And again, because this is based on Re3 data, you have certification as one of the marks that you can easily identify. So you can again easily find certified trustworthy data repositories. And finally, I won't spend too much time on this, but there's also what's known as fair sharing. So this is another registry, and this is run by the Data Readiness Group at the University of Oxford. And this goes a little bit more than Re3 data, as it tries to interlink records on standards for identifying, reporting, citing data and metadata, repositories, journal publishers, and funder data repositories. So it's a little bit complex the way that it tries to interconnect these things. It does not yet highlight the certification of repositories, but will do in the future. But it does allow filtering according to whether a repository is somehow recommended by a domain or topic area, has a publication attached to it, and is maintained by a particular organization. And again, there's some screenshots. So if you go to fairsharing.org, you have the option of looking at the databases. And you can see this is a catalog of databases described according to their guidelines, along with the standards used within them and compiled with the support of the Oxford University Press. So that sort of just gives you a quick overview of what it looks like. And if you dig in again a little further, you have a sort of handy option on the left-hand side that again sort of helps you narrow down your options. But at this moment in time, unfortunately, one of those options is not whether a repository has been certified as trustworthy. And that's it. So thank you so much for listening. I think I'm a tiny bit early, so there may be time for questions, but I'll hand over to Claudia and let her continue her Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you, Rorie. That was really interesting, and it whetted our appetite for more. And more is now, I'm very pleased to introduce Dawei Lin, who is coming all the way from the United States. And Dawei works at the National Institute of Health, NIH, as a scientist there. And he's an expert on bioinformatics and managing and handling huge repositories of health data. And today, Dawei is going to tell us everything we need to know about trust. So thank you for coming, Dawei, and the microphone is yours.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. It's very nice and generous introduction, and also thanks for Rorie for the introduction. I think that we all now know that the trustworthy data repositories is a critical element of the data ecosystem. But then how do we identify a trustworthy database or repository? And how do we build one for the real ones? And how do we kind of operate one? And that's what the trust principles is about, is to easily understand the fundamentals of repository and also how to implement the trustworthiness. Next slide. So I think you see a lot of like what the Rorie show you what is what we already have, but it's really worrisome that when we look at what we have lost, and on the slide you can see like it's only a tiny portion of the data now is in the repositories. It's not necessarily a trustworthy repositories, and even like the data in the repository, and there was like 80% of them at some point and will die from the internet. So those investment are lost that without we sometimes even knowing. And I think the biggest loss though is the opportunities that we can maximize the data that have been even like lost, because we cannot reuse them for the things that we even don't know that we can do. So then so there's a need that we need to understand the fundamentals of repositories so that we can help save our investment. Next slide. And so before we talk about trust principles, and I want to define what we mean by principles. And I like a quote from Rorie. He wrote a book about principles. It's mainly for like investment, but I think it can also apply for the principles for data repositories. So the principles are smart ways for handling things that happen over and over again in similar situations. Next slide. And so so that means that the principles, like the trust principle we talk about, is not new. It has been there over and over again. So the data science is a new word, but the repository is not. You know, it happened in 1960s. And so we have a lot of lessons learned. And so the trust principle is not to replace the current standards or criteria or best practices. And it's about easy to understand the importance of the trustworthy data repositories, you know, how to understand that. So one is easy to understand and easily to measure. And that's how you can build trust. And so basically, it is the idea is provide a high level, a starting point for people who realize the trust is important and try to advocate and support and implement the requirements for ensure the trustworthiness. So it is the purpose is to really facilitate all the stakeholders discussions and then guide the repository operations. And next slide. So I think probably you will hear a lot of concepts in today's workshop. I just kind of gave trying to put them together, like, what is the framework, what is the big picture, and where the trust is located. And so trust, fair, and care are the high-level principles. It's more like inspiration for people to realize the importance of those elements. And then once you realize the importance of this, and you can discuss what other requirements, and that comes down to the characteristics, metrics, criteria, standards. And once you have those framework built, and then you really wanted somebody or yourself to evaluate what you have against those standards. Like say, are you really have all those elements? And those elements, are that effective to elicit trust from your users? So basically, trust is high level, and the TrustSeal as the implementation level, which you will hear more later today. Next slide. So as I said before, the principles are the things like happen over and over again. And so in order to have those principles, we really need to base on the community. And that's how trust principles was developed and built. And so it's almost 2 years now. And then the first we have 3 versions of white papers and just put out the concept and get the comments. And then at the points after the third one, and the concept is pretty solid, and the community that realizes is more than research data lines, and should be like a wide audience. So we wrote the paper and then published at the Nature Scientific Data, and the link can provide in the following slide. The people who are developed this paper and also the white papers, that is from all kinds of domains and all kinds of stakeholders. So that kind of gave the foundation that trust principles are trying to address the fundamental issues. And after the paper published, we host a trust principle symposium and further kind of promote and then help people understand the concept of trust principle. And next slide. This is the trust principle. Is a acronym, and T for transparency, R for responsibility, and U for user focus, S for sustainability, and T for technology. So the transparency is really the foundation of the trust, that you have to be transparent, what you can do and what you can promise, what you promise to do. And the responsibility is really about the action, like, can you do what you're promised to do? And then the user focus is the motivation, that you have to satisfy with users. You gave what the user wants. If they want fair, give them fair. If they want open, give them open. And the sustainability is about duration. So once you figure out what you can do for your users, you want to provide a service or a technology for the long term. And the technology is about operation. You need to realize what you want to do for your users, and then make it secure. And next slide. So this is kind of the detail of the concepts of of each letter of the trust. So for transparency, like term of use and for your repositories, for your data holdings, and also like how long you can keep technology evolved, and how much leeway that you can give to for people to prepare that in case they want to transform a different platform, and also the what kind of services and stewardship you can provide to the sensitive data. And next slide. And responsibility is about the like you do what you promise to do. For example, ensuring the authenticity and integrity of data holdings, and then you want to have appliance to community norms, like they use the metadata standard, curation standard, and you make sure that the data are interoperable, and also they provide the services like people can find data both by human or by machine. And then you manage the intellectual properties. You want to reduce the risk for your users. You make sure like when they take the data, the user don't have to take any risk of violating intellectual property abilities. And next slide. And so user focus is that is you give users like what they want, and like data metrics, and then make them available to the users, and provide the catalogs, and then so they can find the things easily, that like what the Rorie showed you before. And I think the most importantly, that the repository have to monitor what the changes of users' expectations, and then you evolve around the user's need. So it's, you can see that the trust is not static; is constantly changing. Next slide. So sustainability is about that you can provide a service long term, and this is the I think there's a very key concept here. The sustainability should not rely on just funding, like perpetual funding. It should have the plan, like the risk mitigations. Like if you always, nobody have a limited amount of resources, and how do you kind of prepare when the resources is not there? And then so you maintain the operations to allow that happens. And also you have the governance structure to make sure that the long-term preservation is not last-minute plan. Has been in the operation all the time. And next slide. So technology, I think, is pretty simple. It's just like you have enough infrastructure to support your operations, and more importantly, in nowadays, is the cybersecurity. You want, if you want to maintain your integrity of your data, you have to operate in a very secure environment. And next slide. So as I said, that the trust principles are developed from the community, and then we really see that happening. Like, I think that we're really overwhelmed with the endorsement after the trust principles was released at the RDA, and now have 36 organizations and institutions endorse the trust principle, and still counting. And the endorsers range from the founders, publishers, repository communities, professional communities. So it's kind of really have a broad range of acceptance of the trust principles. And then I think we kind of really feel that we have done something right initially, but we should keep on doing it forward. Next slide. And then so the trust principles also receive a lot of academic feedbacks, and so this is the on the website of Nature Scientific Data, and so far I think less than a year we have received like 14,000 access, and there was 8 citations from the scientific data, and if you use Google Scholar, and there was like 25 citations from the published papers and policy papers. So, so we really receive a wide range of response, and then also we kind of have a lot of feedbacks. And the next slide, you will see a snapshot of some of the responses. I mean, there's hundreds of tweets and retweets, so I cannot like include in one slide, but I just want to kind of put some out there. There's a couple of categories, like like the people are really happy. There's now there's trust principles that they can use to understand the trustworthiness, but also there is the people like to pick out a certain part of the trustworthy concepts in the trust principles, and then that's kind of things they like. And also there is I have a kind of screenshot a blog from Nestor, and they have a response to trust principles as one of the endorsers. And I think one thing that I think it was very unique there is that they not only explain what the trust principles are, but also recommend some improvement. And that's kind of the things that we really like to see. And then, for example, like they want the trust principles to make the connections with existing standards, and then form the framework that you understand the trustworthiness, and now you kind of give people guide that how to implement it. So that's kind of the response we have. And also next slide. We're also very happy to see, and people already starting using the trust principles to talk about their repositories. And this is like the 2-slide deck I kind of steal from the Brian Curry and also the Rena Jennings. And so they present the repositories using the trust principles. So I would not let you to kind of read the details of the screen snapshot, but what you can see that they help present their repository in 5 slides. They have this all big operations, very complex operations, but then now they can like put their contents in the trust framework, and to make it understood by not just the expert, but also the people like they're like users and founders and those type of people. So next slide. And so in conclusion, that the trust principles is really provide a mnemonic that to remind the repository stakeholders that the trustworthiness, the repositories are important. This concept and this notion need to be understood by everybody, not just the data repository managers. And also that the trust principles is not the end, it's just starting, is to help they communicate with all the people around the trustworthy repositories, and the trust principles should evolve with the community. So with that, and the next slide, I want to acknowledge that the trust principles are not a single person's effort; it's a community effort, and initially is kind of formulated the very primary concept by the TrustSeal boards, but then I think it presented to the research data alliances and have a large community involved with this, and also at the NIH, the trust principle was the first time used to organize a trustworthy workshop, and that was kind of it was very enlightening to realize that how a simple concept and how people like talk to each other. And also like a lot of the co-authors and the commentators, and now I think endorsers and bloggers and tweeters, they all contribute to the idea of the trust principles. So I will stop there to see if there's an immediate question I can answer, but I can also answer the question later. So I return the floor back to you, Claudia.
Thank you, Dawei. And I should stress something which I did not do at the beginning, that you just reminded me through your last slide that everybody presenting today has multiple hats. We're all very active in our own fields, but we all are very active both at RDA and WDS, either directly or indirectly. And therefore, it's my pleasure to present another person with multiple hats, John Crabtree, who is the head of the Odom Institute for Social Science at the University of North Carolina, and also the Group for Managing Research and Data Information Systems. And he's going to talk about how to certify, in particular, TrustSeal, and talking about multiple hats. John also knows everything about Dataverse. So if you have any doubts concerning what John is going to talk about, but also Dataverse, please feel free to send a question. We are waiting for questions. You are welcome to send them right now. Hi, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to everyone. This is such a great group, and I want to build on where Rorie and Dawei have moved us toward. So how do we, as a repository, how do we define trust? And as a researcher or as a science community member, how do we evaluate these repositories that we're looking at? So we'll look through some of the core TrustSeal and move from there. So next slide. So the core TrustSeal is designed to be an entry level, a place where you can start thinking about your repository and describing it. It's broken down into 3 major areas plus some feedback. So the first one is the background information or the context. We'll talk a little more about each one of these as we go, but this is a really, really important section of the application for core TrustSeal. And then the next group would be how your organization is designed, the infrastructure around that. How do you manage access? How do you do all your organizational infrastructure and things around the infrastructure for that organization in particular? Next slide. And then we'll start talking about how you manage those digital objects. How do we actually treat those objects so we instill those levels of trust that Dawei was talking about? Next slide. And of course, technology is there to underpin all of this. Technology, I like to always say there's 2 T's in trust, but the first one is transparency. The last one is technology. Technology does support all of this, but it's that transparency that needs to come first. And of course, we have some applicant feedback because this is a community ground roots effort where everyone is encouraged to talk about the process, to give us feedback on the applications, communicate with the community, and so we can make this better. Next slide. So I want to start talking about this context of this R0. We say we've got 16 requirements, but we start at 0, so there's actually 17. So this one, to me, is really, really important because it has a few components that are particularly important for the actual reviewers to understand. We need to have a background of your repository. What are your goals? What are your descriptions? How do you describe yourself? Along with that, how do you describe your audience, your designated community? Who are you serving? That repository is doing actions for some community. Is it a narrow community? Is it a broad community? What levels of curation are performed? And this will help us later talk about which type of expertise is required or what things you're taking responsibility for within that trust model, that R. So what are you responsible for? Another critical component here is the in-source or outsource partners. In many, many cases, repositories rely on external technology, external resources, here's where we talk about that and try to get a lay of the land, so to speak. Are we doing everything in-house? Are you relying on your local IT systems in your university? Or are you relying on an external contract with someone to do one or more of these components that we'll talk about? So next slide, and we'll talk about the first R1 of these 16. And this one's fairly simplistic and often overlooked, but the critical component here is, does your organization that's managing this archive or running this archive, do they have an explicit mission to provide access and preserve this data? This is really important because going forward, as things change, and we all know governments change and funding models change, if it's in that mission, then as a researcher, when you read this application, you understand that this is their mission to preserve my data. So this is a core component of those repositories and the organizations managing those repositories. So it's critically important to start off with a really good mission statement, one that mentions that you're providing access in the long term and doing actions to preserve that data for the domain and for those designated community, those users you're talking about. Next. The next part talks about, do you have the rights to do that? Their researchers deposit this data with these archives and these communities, but do they have the right to provide access in the future? Have you documented that access and use? Are these license agreements in place? Do they allow you to give this data out to the public? And if there are restrictions, what are those restrictions? There are many types of these data use agreements, and we'll talk about some others as we move forward and we start talking about confidentiality or the ability to make copies and preserve. Right now, we're talking about, in this particular R2, we're talking more about, do you have the rights to make access to this data available to users and who you have that access? So next. So the third, R3, this one sometimes is really difficult to explain because we have to think about it in a long term. Or do we have a continuity plan that's going to ensure that these data are valuable data are accessible over time? Now, which time is that? It depends upon what your responsibility. You have to be very transparent. Are you going to provide access to these for 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, long-term, 30 years potentially for some archives? So what is that continuity of access plan? How are you going to do that? Number one, how long are you going to take responsibility for these data holding? And under the governance of that, how are you going to manage this over time? What happens to the data if you do have some challenges with funding or other responsibilities? Here's where we describe that and talk about the governance and how we're going to manage this data, giving all the risks that happen when circumstances change, whether mission has changed or funding has changed. Next, R4. So at R4, this is another data use agreement type of a requirement that we describe all about how we are adhering to ethics and norms for your community. Each community is a little different. We, for example, at the Odom Institute, we're in the social science community. We're really important users that worry about confidentiality and disclosure of sensitive information, whether direct or indirect. So we have to be real careful with that when we have data about our users here. But each community has different ethics and norms. And are you following those? Do you disclose that, for example? And how do you take those norms and put them in your policies? And do you have trained staff that knows how to manage this type of disclosure risk? There are different types of training for different types of communities. So does that repository know how to handle your data? As a researcher, if you have data that has some confidentiality issues or some ethics issues, you need to understand this. Do they have the ability to do that? Do they have the skills to do that? And as a repository, you want your user community to understand what you're promising and give them the ability to understand what do you do and what steps you take to secure their data. Next, R5. So now we talk a little bit more about the organizational infrastructure. Are there adequate funding and number of qualified staff to actually carry out those missions and manage those documents and work within the frameworks of this? We all know that the most important part of any repository or any organization are its staff members. And are those staff members provided the right tools and equipment and training on an ongoing basis to provide all of this critical skills? Now, there is one set of skills we'll talk about a little later in R6 that talks a little bit more about skills at the actual data object level. Here, we just want to be sure that there's funding and there's IT resources and there's a range of expertise to manage the entire mission of the organization. So next. So R6, is what I was referring to just a little earlier, is a little more detailed. And it relates back to R0, where we talked about the designated community and levels of curation and types of data you're going to be curating. Does those responsibilities that they've taken for this data include curation or need information from disciplinary experts to be able to manage those data and understand what it takes to manage this data for the long term? We all know things change, technologies change, data formats change. Our research community will be using something different in 5 years than they are today. So do we have feedback from the experts in the community to help manage these data over time, whether this be internal to your organization or an external advisory board? We need some sort of external guidance or expert guidance to be able to help manage the data over time, because we know good science changes and evolves and adapts to this very rapid pace that we're seeing in science today. Next. So in 7, we're transitioning a little bit here into this digital object management. Now we're starting to talk not about the organizational structure and the people and the policies, but also more about how you're going to manage the individual data. So here we're looking at the data object itself, protecting that integrity of not only the data itself, but also any metadata, because we know that without quality metadata, these data are not very usable into the future or even now. It's really important to control these metadata. So for this requirement, what we're looking for here are things like checksums, things about documentation of completeness, understanding how everything in the data, the world of the data. We all know that data don't live in isolation. There are lots of things that go around that data. And what we want to do is manage all of those together here and be sure that they're linked appropriately. They have version control and managing all of those things around that data as well. So next. So we all would love to keep everything. You can look at my barn at my farm and tell that I like to keep everything, but we know it's not appropriate to keep everything. We need to appraise these things. Look at your designated community. Make decisions based upon your designated community on what things that they need, which formats do they need, what things are appropriate for the archive. If we don't appraise appropriately, things start to add up in the archive that are just not relevant to your community. Appraisal is also not a one and done thing. You have to reappraise. You have to look at over time to the process. And one thing that that we'll talk about a little later in the Core TrustSeal process, this Core TrustSeal requirements are an ongoing thing. We want to improve and work toward these things. So each time you renew, you're going to be looking at changes. So it's the same thing with appraisal. You should always be looking for things to evolve and reappraising the formats in your archive, reappraising all of your resources that are in this archive, and cleaning that stuff up. It's really, really important. So R9 next. So 9 is where we start talking a little bit about documenting the storage procedures. So it's real easy on this R9 to jump straight into the storage and the technology and your RAID arrays and all those cool technical things that your tech people like to talk about. But this is really more about documenting the workflow for your storage. What are the processes? Does the repository and the archivist and the people managing the repository understand all of the storage locations? Do they have a strategy for those multiple copies, right? What are the risk management techniques? How do they manage these things? So this is documentation. The technical stuff we'll talk about later, and I like to always think of it back to those T's. The last T is technology. It underpins all of this. It's super important, but it's really that transparency, it's that responsibility, it's your users, it's the sustainability, all of these things that sit on that technology that are really, really important, the things that Dawei was talking about. So in this R9, we're talking about documenting your storage procedures and what you do and being sure that everyone in your organization, from your archivist through your technical folks, understand this workflow. And it's really important to understand archival storage. And at any point in any of these conversations, using the OAIS terms or understanding the foundation of OAIS to just help describe these is always helpful for researchers and also helpful for the reviewers who have to read your applications. So R10. R10 starts talking about the preservation plan. Clearly, there are things that are in the technical side in the storage of this, but this is really getting to, does the depositor release the rights to create long-term preservation and multiple copies for preservation? And does the archive do the things necessary to take responsibility to make sure that these are preserved in the long term for the designated community? Critical example, for example, here at the Odum Institute, we have a lot of quantitative data. Quantitative data comes in multiple formats. Many formats are proprietary, and we know that those proprietary formats won't be around 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now. So here we generate surrogates for our preservation packages that are more sustainable. They're more open source. So we can use these data in the future, even if these software packages, like for example, SPSS, go away in the future, we still have copies of that. And that's an example in the social science realm, but depending on your designated community and your responsibility and rights to undertake those, we need to document here in this preservation plan. Next. So this is looking down into the data. And this is another situation where when someone reviews an application, they're thinking back to that R0. Who is your designated community? Which levels of curation have you said you would do? How do you take an approach for the data and the metadata quality? How do you look? What do you do to look at these data? Are you looking at just checksums, or being sure that the actual object is valid, or are you actually looking into that data and looking into the technical components about this? The idea here is that, do you have the appropriate expertise in your organization to make an evaluation of this data, of its quality and metadata quality, and be sure that there's enough information that it can be used into the future? When we talk about fair data, you talk about the reuse of data, interoperability of data, it really gets down to this data quality, and it really depends upon the designated community and the type of data, and your organization needs to talk about what type of resources you have to actually ensure this data quality. And here's where we really talk about this data quality. Next. So this also gets back into the workflows or the handling of that data from the beginning to end. How you take those submission packets or those SIPs, when they come into your organization, what things do you do to those objects to move them from those submission packets into the archival information packets, or those AIPs, and then eventually to the dips that are delivered to the users. So where are these workflows and how are we to define these workflows, and understanding who's responsible in your organization for each area of these workflows. And if you do transformations, describing these transformations. What tools do you use? For example, if I'm taking that SPSS file and turned it into a tab delimited file for the future. In our case, we use R, for example, to do that. Some R scripts handled by Python. Are those documented? Do we do those things? And when you have changeover in your organization, do everyone in the organization understand that workflow? Here is, if you can describe it on paper what you do, you have a better chance of actually performing this through the long term here. So because what we're talking about, as organizations change, do we follow these same workflows through time? Next. So data discovery and identification. Do we have a way to allow these the designated community to find them in a persistent way and be able to cite it? A critical importance here is the ability to cite these data. Data are valuable. The citations for data are going up, along with DOIs and people using persistent identifiers now. What we're seeing is those things grow fast. So we want to really, really facilitate the ability to identify the data. Next. R14 talks about data reuse. How are we going to reuse this into the future? Again, we talked about earlier about which formats and which formats that data need to be done. Just in the preservation community talked about that, how we preserve those going forward, but we need to target this for that designated community. Just as we did before, we're talking about what are the measures to evolve formats, as I spoke about before. Next. So we're down to the last two, and here's where the technology comes in. And this is where we start talking about those rate arrays and how we talk about the software used. And if it's community supported software, how do we, or open source software, how do we manage that software here? Here's where your contracts for commercial softwares, here we talk about those, your infrastructure, your storage arrays, whether you use cloud services, how you manage all of it. This is the nuts and bolts of your repository and how that's handled, and discussing that. So next. And then we talk about the security. Dawei mentioned this. It's really critical in these days that your resources are not secure if you haven't done security scans, manage your authentication, your authorization. It's real important. All your IT folks understand this, but it is critical that we look at that and describe that in this R16. So that's the 16. So let's next. So how all of this operationalized? So the Core TrustSeal board oversees all of these, the governance and manage, and there's a link here you can talk about that talks a little bit more about our infrastructure. Next. But let's just talk through this process to try to make it as simple as possible. So these requirements are written in English, 16 requirements. You just do an online application for these. These applications are reviewed by 2 community members. This is a peer review. So as community members review these things, and as your repository is approved, then someone from your organization will become a member of this assembly of reviewers, and you will be reviewing your peers. So it's a peer review process, and it's an iterative process that the board reviews. So not only do the 2 reviewers that are anonymous to your organization review, but also the board oversees that. And there's some feedback. So it's not a one and done. The idea here is to assist repositories in getting better over time and helping them describe and work through their application. Next. So ideally, these are public documents. It's really important that your community understand all of these policies and make this public. The idea here is to be public. Your applications will be public in the end, but the evidence given in those really should be public if at all possible. We understand there are cases where it's not possible, but what we want to do is make as much public available as we can. And the other thing I'd like to mention is it's not always a yes or no. There's a gradient, a compliance level here. we understand that no one is perfect, that we're all working towards that perfection, and we should be working towards getting better each time. Even if you're at level 4 on these, you still should be working towards that. And there is a potential that a requirement is not applicable, and you just need to explain that as well. This idea of continuous improvement is built into the core TrustSeal, and that's why it's reviewed every 3 years. Next. So there is an administrative fee to help manage the process for this. It's a 3-year certification, so this is the 1,000 euros covers you for a 3-year period. And these are, as I mentioned before, they're publicly available. And we want to ensure that the technology, and as science changes, so does your approach toward this approach towards managing the data. And in that same light, the certification process is also reviewed every 3 years. So we reviewed that in 2019, and we look through that so we make sure that we cover things as time goes on. Next. So this application process is pretty simple. Notice there is some feedback, and we can go back through this process. So it's not a send it and we're done. This is we work closely with the reviewers, with the board, and with the applicants to be sure this process is as smooth as possible. Next. This is an online situation, so we can actually have really nice forms to fill out online. The reviewers are reviewing online, so it's a smooth tool. We have an application management tool now that helps you through this process. Next. And there's lots of resources to help you. One critical resource on our website linked here are the actual applications that have been approved. You can go find a repository that's similar to yours, of the same potentially discipline or file format types, and look at what they're doing. It's real important to review these prior to filling out your application or prior to building your team at your organization, which is really important to build that team at your organization, because it's going to take not just 1 or 2 people, it's going to take your whole organization to fill out all of these various requirements. And there's some extended guidance, and the requirements themselves are linked here. This link here points you to a Zenodo link where you can look through those. I think it's important to review the extended guidance. It has lots of tips, not only for the reviewers, which your organization will be a part of that assembly of reviewers once approved, but it also is for the applicants, so they know exactly what these reviewers are looking for. So next. And one thing that we're seeing, and I'll wrap up here, is that, and I think Rorie mentioned this, as the diversity of organizations applying have been increasing, we've been looking into how do we manage these more generalist repositories. As we talked about through all the requirements, in many cases, it depends on the type of data, the type of discipline, and the requirements require you to have certain expertise in-house inside your organization to manage that data, to curate that data. And if these are self-deposited data for generalist repositories, it's very difficult for one organization to hold all of that expertise and be able to manage that data. So we're starting to look at how we manage these specialist repositories versus generalist repositories. And again, this is a community effort, just like Trust and just like the Core Seal was founded. We've opened it up for comments. We got over 500 pieces of feedback. We're going through all of that feedback. We're looking at what's required, and we're definitely open to the community to build the right solution for this as we move forward with Core TrustSeal. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide and hand it back over to Claudia, and we'll move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, John. This was, wow, we have lots of messages already with questions. And I'd ask all of you to open your cameras so we can all appear, including those who are still to speak. Okay, and I'm going to start with a simple question because it's directed at FAPESP. And there's this question about whether FAPESP requires data deposit in a certified repository. And the answer is no, it's not compulsory. What is compulsory is that all data produced by projects totally or partially financed by FAPESP be published in repositories that are carefully managed under good practices and professionally managed. And the whole presentation today, I do encourage everybody who's listening and will be listening on the YouTube to go through the slides, because they have lots and lots of very useful information. So please continue sending your questions to eScience@fapesp.br in Portuguese or English. And now we have a very pertinent and complex question about financing. So the question is the following, and I just lost the question, of course, because of course this is all technology. Just 1 millisecond. I'm so sorry. Okay, there you are. How to manage the production of multilateral or multinational agreements regarding data first, but also who is going to be responsible for paying to create and maintain the repository. We already have to pay to publish papers, and we already have to pay to read papers. So now our researchers forced to pay to have repositories, deposit their data, and so on and so forth. So this is a general question, and will you please, who wants to start answering?
I can start.
Okay, Mohammed. Mohammed, I haven't presented you yet, so we'll leave that as suspense.
Okay. So just a quick reaction to the question, Claudia. The question about the cost and who should pay. I think this is a really important question, and actually providing repositories and research data repositories in particular is really key to fulfilling the mandate for researchers. And it is really a very good point. If a researcher has a mandate coming, for example, from their funders to publish their data sets in a trustworthy repository, and these trustworthy repositories are not funded, then this is basically an unfunded requirement for the researcher. There's no solution. So stakeholders like funders, research performing organizations, universities, all of the stakeholders involved in the data management ecosystem have a responsibility to fund research data infrastructures and to provide those services so that researchers can fulfill the mandate which is put on them to manage their data responsibly and store them in trustworthy repositories. So I think the question goes back to the funders and to the research ecosystem as such. But I think the key point here is you cannot have trust for free. That's the point. Mm-hmm. It will have to cost, and someone will have to pay for it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Claudia,
Dawei.
I just had a quick reference. I think recently the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, they published a workshop report, the forecasting cost for preserving, archiving, and promoting access to biomedical data. That have a lot of discussions about the cost, the investment, and how to kind of sustain the operation. And that maybe, have more information about, answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
May I add something, Claudia, to that?
Yes.
So I think from the perspective of the, we do see some developments in this area. So from the perspective of the repository, of course, we see that a lot of repositories still depend for a large part on project funding, which is in a way a little bit in contrast to their long-term preservation mission. So there we need to, the funders need to be more aware of the importance, and I also think the policymakers of the importance of this sustainability aspects for the longer term. And from the perspective of the researcher, of course, it shouldn't be the researcher who pays for this. And there we also see some development. For example, what we see usually is at first funders make data management, including the storage of data, eligible within project funding. But then that is also not the solution, because again, then it's an incidental funding, and at a certain point in time it stops. And you can also not ask from a researcher to use part of their research funding for data management. Usually the researchers are evaluated on the basis of their academic work. So as long as there is no incentive to really put effort into that, we have a problem there as well. So there really needs to come to be found a sustainable long-term solution that is not bothering the researchers and that provides a sustainable long-term basis financially for repositories. But that is a long way to go with tiny steps in the right direction.
Thank you. I think John wanted to say something as well.
Yes, I'll just want to add one little piece about the incentive. I think Ingrid is exactly right on point there, that we need to find incentives. But what I'm starting to see a little bit of change is that the incentive for organizations such as universities or governmental agencies to fund these repositories lie within the value of the data. The data themselves are valuable commodities. The data is the fuel for future research. Longitudinal research, comparative research is really important. And without the data, you cannot apply for new grants, because you must have access to these data in order to apply for these grants. The second point I'd like to make too is many groups are looking to push forward requirements for reproducibility, to be sure your research is reproducible. And there's also some liability there. So when universities or organizations are tasked with being sure that this research is reproducible and valid research, there is some liability for those organizations. And we've seen some of the lawyers talk about this. Well, we need this data to be provided in the future in case we have to prove that we have been able to reproduce this evidence. So I think there are some slow changes. I think Ingrid is exactly right. It's going to change slowly over time, but there are some incentives, and this community, as researchers as well, need to talk about those incentives to the organizations to keep that moving in that right direction.
Thank you. Mustafa wants to speak a little bit more.
Yeah, just a quick point to add, Claudia. Actually, also from a funder perspective, I think we had a discussion on funding the infrastructure, so the data repositories to support the researchers, but there's also funding the data management activities during the lifetime of a research project. And I think funders are now more and more making those costs eligible for funding. So you can basically get, as part of your grant to do research, part of the costs used for data management. And this could actually include also, to some extent, the costs of depositing if there is an attached cost to deposit your data sets within a repository. It doesn't answer the question of how do we fund the infrastructure, but at least from the researcher side, it facilitates fulfilling the mandate to manage your data.
We have now a set of questions, but I'd just like to add concerning this cost that all of you in your presentations, you kept emphasizing lots of many important things, but when we come down to details, it's all about people. It's about trust, it's about training, it's about sharing, and people cost money. So to create and maintain repositories, it costs money, okay? And I'd like just to point out to all of those who are in the state of São Paulo, whenever you get a grant from FAPESP, your institution also gets money. And this money can go towards building the infrastructure for depositing data and papers, okay? And your project, you can also demand not to build a repository or to curate the data. So now I'd like to, there are actually 4 questions. And one of them, well, I had already asked it, but it got lost in discussing, which is really very relevant, which are the following. How do we deal to multi-institutional and multi-country projects when there are different legislations regarding data sharing? And how do we penalize people who commit crimes against data? That's not how it was formulated, but it's basically how to deal with improper use or unethical use of data or stealing data. Okay, so who wants to answer about multinational and penalties? Oh, Mohammed. Mustafa. Okay, please, my apologies, okay? I keep
no problem,
calling you by the name of a friend who looks like you. And I promise never to do that again until the next time I talk to you, okay?
No problem, Claudia. Just to maybe to give a perspective on the multilateral, I mean, when research is performed in an international context or multilateral context, I think this is actually a very tricky question because it raises the question of the issue of the legal context or national legislations getting in the way of sharing data. I think it boils down to the framework in which the data is performed. There are already international agreements and international projects which provide a framework for sharing data across borders and across nations. I think particularly of the context of Earth observation and where satellites are being used by countries to collect data from other countries, and it's in the interest of everyone to share data. So there's a well-known initiative called the Group on Earth Observation, which provides this international framework to share Earth observation data across countries. But obviously this is not applicable to all kinds of data, and some data will have some sensitivities. And I'm thinking, for example, seismological data. Seismological data in some contexts is quite sensitive because it can, for example, indicate information about nuclear tests. So some countries are very careful with sharing these kinds of data. So I think it really depends on the context. Some data are have less sensitivities and can be shared easily if it's not against the legal national legal framework across borders, and some others are more difficult to share. But usually this is part of what we call the data management planning. Addressing these issues are part of the research data management planning. So when you start your research project, you already put on the table all these constraints and think about how you're going to deal with this. If my research requires international collaboration, then I have to pay attention to how I'm going to share the data across borders and what are the legislations I need to comply with.
So who wants to complement? Dawei wants to say something, I believe.
Yeah, I think I just want to, I think probably the questions that I think the people may ask different way of how to use the data without considering the risk, right? I think that was the the repository's responsibility to make sure that they have the legal framework put there, and then when user use the data, they're really kind of use it the way that they're graded to. And I think there's more about open data right now is, like say the people can use to leverage the value of the data instead of like when you use the data from repositories, you feel like the stealing. I think people will probably more accustomed to that when you get a data from a trustworthy repository, that you are free to use it. You're, release your imagination and innovation to use that data to leverage the value.
I have other questions, so maybe we better go on, and then Ingrid wants to complement. Please, Ingrid.
Just one practical point as an addition to what has been said earlier on. I'd like to make people aware of the fact that within the Research Data Alliance, there is work being done on legal interoperability. So there is a whole sub-community there thinking about the interoperability of data in an interdisciplinary and international context. So everyone who is interested in that topic, I'd like to suggest to have a look at the RDA website and this work there.
Thank you. The next question, and then I'll go to other questions, is again to FAPESP about wouldn't it make more sense for FAPESP to host a centralized data repository than just providing a search for some repositories? So what is done around the world concerning repositories? Are they distributed? Are they centralized? How does this work? Let me answer on behalf of FAPESP. FAPESP's business is financing research. You must remember that the state of São Paulo is responsible for 25% of all research in Latin America. If we are to create at FAPESP and maintain a repository, that would have an enormous cost in people, specialized people to maintain it, and therefore we would not be able to finance research of the people who are producing these data. Okay, so we can discuss this afterwards, but I'd like to ask all of you who wants to answer a little bit more about how it's done around the world. Distributed, centralized, hosted at the funder, partially or totally paid by funders.
Mm-hmm.
Ingrid wants to say something, or?
Yeah.
Oh, Dawei, please go ahead, Dawei.
Yeah, so I think NIH as a major funding agencies for biomedical research, we found probably hundreds of repositories, and then there's all running different ways. Like there is centralized repositories, there is the international collaborations, like you mentioned earlier, that like say for example that there's the gene bank is how for the DNA sequence data is run by US, Japan, and Europe. So they kind of constantly change the data. So so I think the point is that there's no one way to operate repositories. It really depend on the needs of that particular community. I think and the funding mechanism is the same thing. Like is that really kind of based on the community need to decide what is the form is better to serve the users.
Thank you. Anybody else? Ingrid, please.
Maybe I can add the example of how we try to organize things in my little country, the Netherlands. There we work very much with a kind of model that distinguishes between a front office role and a back office role, meaning that the front offices are locally based. So let's say at the universities, there you have people who provide solutions, virtual research environments for the storage of the data during research. And next to that, we have a couple of places in the Netherlands where we provide real long-term preservation of data in trustworthy repositories. So there are a couple of those facilities in the Netherlands that provide that solution on a national scale, and they also have different sorts of expertise, so a focus on different domains and disciplines. So that provides a kind of a division of roles, because being a trustworthy repository, as we have heard, comes at a cost. So it's good to create a kind of economies of scale and not have each and every university set up their own trustworthy repository, but try to have a couple of them centralized that cater to the needs of all of those local front offices. So that's the idea, the setup in the country. Yeah.
John, I think, wanted to say something, or am I mistaken? Yes or no? No.
I'm good.
So, me too. So, I think I have another question. No, okay. Dawei and Ingrid. So, let me go to a last question, because we only have 5 more minutes, and it's about what I would call data in the wild, in the sense that once you publish data, it can be copied, and afterwards, how to ensure that it's not going to be misused, and how to handle that issue of who will be responsible for data leaks, which is not the very, it's an associated question. So first of all, if you publish data, it's out there, right? And then it can be copied by other people, and afterwards it may be used in ways we don't imagine. And how to control or avoid misuse.
Yeah, I can jump into that question first.
Thank you.
And so I think that exactly what the repositories are trying to help, right? I think that when you take the data, you make sure the data is the integrity is protected, and then have the checksum. I think that John mentioned in the technology session, like make sure the data is correct data you're like promised to have, and also we'll create the citations, and that would probably can provide some provenance information, like where the data coming from, and trace back to the repositories, and that is the authentic copy that you should trust. So instead of you kind of go to some website and then people can change data underneath. So I think that's I think I kind of come back to the question again, how the data can be trustworthy, and that's I think the theme when we talk about that, using the trustworthy data repository, not necessarily certified repository, to make sure that the data is flow well, within the ecosystem.
Thank you. And Mustafa has raised his hand.
Yeah, I'm actually intrigued by this question, because if we ask the question, what will happen when the data are out in the wild, we should also ask the same question about publications. When we do publish an article, it's out in the wild. Did we ask what if people misuse the publication? I don't think it's an issue currently, so I don't know why it should be an issue for data. What I'm trying to say here is that data sets, if they're sensitive, they should not go out in the wild. And this is the role of a trustworthy repository, to make sure that this doesn't happen. When you talked about data leaks, a trustworthy repository should protect a sensitive data set from data leaks, because it takes all the necessary measures to protect this sensitive data to go out in the wild. But if it's an open access, if it's a data set that is in publicly available, then it is out in the wild, and actually we want it to be reused. Misused is not, I think, an issue here. We want it to be reused. If it's reused for bad or good purposes, that's a very subjective way of looking at reuse scenarios, but we want it to be reused because it's a public data set. And going back to the trustworthiness aspect, again, the trustworthy data repository will have all the necessary capabilities to protect sensitive data sets from being misused, and actually has a responsibility as well to monitor if those sensitive data sets are not being legitimately accessed, for example.
Oh yeah, and John wants to say something.
Just one quick follow-up to that. As our scientific community moves toward more of a reproducibility concept and requiring people to deposit into these trusted repositories that are managing these data, if someone used a public data set and manipulated it inappropriately or changed it inappropriately, when that data and article were published together in this new world that we hope to see coming forward, you would see that, and it'd be a peer review process, not only of the article, as we're very accustomed to, but also a peer review process of the data and the code that produced those charts and figures in that article. So as we move towards this open world, what we'll see is transparency, and that's what that T is about. If someone wants to use that data, that's great, but tell me how you used it. Show me what you did. Show me your code. And in that world, there can be no misuses because everyone knew exactly how they did it. And the scientific community has the ability to make that determination and say, no, that was an inappropriate use, and that's not valid findings. And that's the same, that's no different than reviewing a published article as reviewing that data, just as Mustafa pointed out.
Thank you. And actually, this covers also another question that concerned penalties and checking and monitoring misuse of data. And all of you somehow covered that issue. Let me again remind everyone that even if your questions are not answered right now, they will be answered or complemented through email. So even though we are a little bit early, but I think we can continue with the second part. There will be another question and answer session at the end. And meanwhile, let me now present Mustafa Mokran. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Ingrid first.
It's my pleasure not to make mistakes and commit mistakes in being the moderator, whatever, of the session. And it is my great pleasure to reintroduce Ingrid Dillo, who is the Deputy Director of the Data Archiving and Networking Services in the Netherlands, called DANS. And she's also a member of the RDA Council, and she's going to cover a very important topic, which is around FAIR, that everybody talks about and nobody knows what it really means in reality. We all say we do FAIR, but are we really fair-sizing? Please, Ingrid, thank you.
So I have the toughest topic to present then. So thank you very much for the kind introduction, Claudia. And well, in the first part of this workshop, we have now heard all the ins and outs of certification and core TrustSeal. And we were also introduced to the trust principles. So now we are going to turn to another and maybe also a more familiar set of principles for you, the FAIR principles, and talk really about how they fit into this trust and certification contexts. So although FAIR is a difficult topic, I will give it a go. So next slide. So those FAIR principles were defined a couple of years ago. It all started off in Leiden, which is a city which is really not even 15 kilometers from where I'm sitting at the moment. And it happened all at a workshop that was organized at the university in Leiden. And the context of that workshop was the life sciences. And that is something that is important to be aware of. And you can see here on the slide the nice poster that they made for that workshop. So the starting point for the FAIR principles was in 2014, some time ago. And the principles were really focused on scientific data management and stewardship. Next slide. So after that initial definition of the FAIR principles, standing for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, in 2016, 2 years later, that led to a substantive article, again in Nature Scientific Data, the same journal in which the trust principles were published a couple of years later. And on the basis of those 4 principles, people also thought about further refining and further operationalizing those 4 FAIR guiding principles. And what came from that is, you can see here on box 2, 15 metrics that really help with the implementation of those FAIR principles. Next slide. So here again, in a different graph, you see the 4 principles on the left-hand side. And next to that, you see icons that represent all of those different metrics that were formulated to, let's say, execute those principles. So the first principle is about the findability of data. And that, of course, is also the first step in reusing data. You first need to find them. So we need metadata and data that are easy to find, not only for humans, but also for machines. And this machine actionability element really comes, I think, from the fact that the FAIR principles were initially designed in the context of the life sciences that were already quite advanced in that way. So the second principle is the principle of accessibility, because once a user finds the data, he or she also needs to know how they can be accessed, and possibly also elements like authentication and authorization play a role. Taking it one step further again, then you come at the interoperability of data, because very often data need to be integrated with other data sets in order for a researcher to conduct research. So in addition, the data needs to interoperate with applications or workflows for analysis of the data, storage of the data, and the processing of the data. And then finally, we have the element of the reusability of the data. And that is really the ultimate goal of FAIR, optimizing the reuse of data sets. And to achieve that, metadata and data should be very well described so that they can be replicated and or combined with other data sets and in different settings. So if you look at this whole conglomerate of principles and metrics, I think that you could very well say that FAIR, being FAIR, really means that you take care of high quality and responsible management of the data that you generate. Next slide. So what about the success of those FAIR principles? Well, I can tell you that the FAIR principles are very well known among policymakers, among funders, and among data service providers. But it's also not a secret that they are much less known among researchers. And here you see the result of a survey that was performed last year among a large group of international researchers from all around the world. And they were asked how familiar they were with the FAIR principles in relation to open data. And you can see here the results over the last 3 years. And you can see that the familiarity is growing, but still only 1 out of 4 researchers is really familiar with the FAIR principles. And almost 40% of them, even in 2020, has never heard of them. Now, in itself, that might not be a problem, because being fair with your data really means that you do responsible management of your data, but still it does say something, I think. Next slide. Another element of the FAIR principles is that I think, and Claudia already alluded to that there is still a lot of confusion about them. What does it really mean? Well, let me tell you my personal opinion. First of all, I think that we are working in the wrong direction if we speak of data sets that are fair and data sets that are not fair. I would like to see it really as a continuum, and each and every researcher should try to make their data as fair as possible. So it's a kind of ideal situation that we should all strive for, but in some cases it might not be possible to reach for the ultimate 100%. And there also seems to be a lot of confusion between the concept of open data on the one hand and fair data on the other hand. Because there really is a difference. You can have a data set that is completely 100% openly available, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that data set is also fair. It can be open, but if there is no good description of the data, it doesn't have a persistent identifier, etc., then it's not fair at all. And it always also works the other way around. You can have a perfectly fair data set, but if it contains very sensitive information, it can never be completely openly available. So open and fair is definitely not the same. Next slide. On this slide, I have a couple of observations. So first of all, I think from what I talked about up till now, it is pretty clear that the focus of the FAIR principles is on data and the associated metadata. The metrics really speak to them. A second observation is that we really see around the FAIR principles what I would call a kind of evolution in time. And I think Dawei already made this point also in relation to the trust principles. So first we had the FAIR principles. The FAIR principles were very generic and a very high level. Then we got the operationalization of those principles in those metrics. And now we are in a phase where we see all kinds of implementations popping up. So we see that people are producing tools and guidance for researchers to produce fair data. We see that funders are looking for instruments and tools, and publishers as well, that enable them to assess the fairness of existing data. We see tools popping up that would help you with what they call the verification of existing data, so making data more fair. And finally, I think we are on the way to create a whole fair ecosystem of fair tools and data and services. All of that meant to improve the quality, the technical quality of the data in order to make them more reusable, and in that way also contributing to open science in general. And a final observation would be that the fairness of a data set of a digital object really gives you a snapshot in time. So it is looking at the data set really in isolation of its context. And this is an observation that I will come back to. So next slide, please. So if I say it's only a snapshot in time, I mean that research data do not become fair by magic, and they also most definitely not stay fair by magic. We need far more than the researcher creating the data set. We need skilled people, transparent processes, interoperable technologies, and all kinds of collaborations, because we need to build and maintain research data infrastructures for those data sets. And if we need all of that, you might think that fair data really maybe are only a fairy tale. Well, next slide. I don't think that that is the case, but what it do means is that there are many, many dependencies with the data infrastructure in which digital objects are managed and preserved. And let me illustrate this with an example. So if we look at the F for the findability of a data set, and we want to assess that, then we have those 4 metrics that are defined under that broad principle for findable. The metrics say that the data and the metadata should have a persistent identifier, and that the data should be described with rich metadata. So there should be a lot of documentation available. And thirdly, the metadata need to include the identifier that is mentioned in F1. If you look at these 3 metrics, you could say, well, these are all really tied to the data set itself. We don't need a context for that. The 4th one says, the 4th metric on the right-hand side says the metadata, the data are registered or indexed in a searchable resource. Well, that is something that you cannot arrange within the data set itself. For that, you need a repository that provides technology, procedures, expertise, and people. Really, the repository where the data lives makes sure that that data set is searchable. But also, if you look at the 3 earlier metrics that seem to really be only tied to the data set itself, usually it's not something that the researcher, him or herself, arranges. This happens once a data set is deposited in a repository. The repository makes sure that it gets a persistent identifier. It prescribes certain metadata schema, etc., etc. So the repository really has an important role to play when it comes to making data fair. Next slide. Here you see a graph that maps the 16 requirements that John explained from core TrustSeal with the 15 metrics of FAIR. And as you can see, there is a lot of overlap. So a lot of requirements for repositories really directly or indirectly refer to the fairness of the repository holdings. So, for example, with respect to metadata standard use, with respect to persistent identifiers, and with respect to the format in which your data are gathered, etc., etc. A lot of the requirements for the repositories really add to the fairness of the data that the repository holds. Next slide. So it is very important to think hard and deep about the environment in which you let your data set live. Trustworthy repositories really add value because they, in a way, guarantee a kind of baseline fairness of your data set because they have all those requirements. But we do need to remember that the researcher himself also has a role to play. So if you go to a trustworthy repository, you will find data sets with different fairness levels, because sometimes the researcher, him or herself, puts more effort into creating rich metadata, etc. But there is always a core line, a baseline fairness of your data set if you put it in a trustworthy repository. And next to that, we also need to be aware that the repository also contributes to the maintenance of the fairness of your data, and sometimes even increases the fairness of your data, because they curate the data, and they also take care of the stewardship of your data over time, when you are already working with creating yet another data set. The repository takes that responsibility. Next slide. So here you see that depicted in a different way. In order to guarantee that the data become and remain fair, we need to assess both the objects as well as the repository, because we need them both when it comes to creating fair data. So in that sense, the combination on the one hand of core TrustSeal as an assessment method for the repository, and a fair assessment tool to assess the fairness of the data, in combination really gives you the optimum. So what we really are looking for is certified repositories that enable fair data. And Mustafa will elaborate on this and also talk about tools to really assess the fairness of data in a trustworthy repository. Next slide. Oops, I'm sorry about that. This would be my takeaway message based on what I just explained to you. It is very clear that we need to share our data in order to turn open science into reality. Data sharing is really, I think, a fundamental element in open science. We see the FAIR principles really as an instrument to help us to define high quality and transparent research data management. Like I said, if you follow those FAIR principles, it is really all about taking good care of your data. And then finally, we need certification mechanisms like Core TrustSeal for digital repositories as a means to create trust in the research data infrastructure. And that data infrastructure, those repositories, in their turn, are again needed to make sure that our FAIR data remain accessible and accessible also for the future. So it's FAIR data in a trustworthy data repository, helping us to realize open science as our vision for the future. And there I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ingrid, for including this play with words, accessibility and accessibility, because accessibility also requires independent verification. It's not enough for me to say I'm fair, my data are fair, and the world is wonderful, right? And since the world is wonderful, it is now I'm going to do it right, it's my pleasure to introduce Mustafa Mokrane, who I met for the first time in an RDA meeting where he was extremely helpful and kind and showed how knowledgeable he is to me, okay? And now he's going to extend this kindness and knowledgeability, which is a word I just invented, to all of you. Mustafa works for DANS, and he's also a co-lead in several European projects. And he's going now to show us the how of FAIR. Thank you, Mustafa. Microphone's yours.
Thank you, Claudia. I take it with pleasure. Thank you for the introduction. So I'll follow up on previous presentation, especially Ingrid's presentation on the interplay between trustworthiness of repositories and the FAIR principles and how these really are necessary to be taken together. So I will concentrate in this presentation on how to make and check if your data are fair. Quickly, a bit of publicity first. I'm working at DANS and also involved in a European funded project called FAIR's Fair. And this project, as you can tell by the name, has as main objective to foster fair data practices in Europe. And it aims to supply practical solutions. And I insist on the practicality aspect. I will really concentrate on practical solutions here for the use of fair data principles throughout the research data lifecycle, with an emphasis on fostering the fair data culture. So this is the socio-technical aspect, and also uptake of good practices where there is more of an implementation aspect to make data fair. So very quickly, in a nutshell, FAIR's Fair is a 3 years project. We started in March 2019, and we will end in March next year. It's a 10 million euro project with 22 partners from 8 member states in Europe. So very large consortium with 6 core partners, and DANS is the lead partner in this project. So practical solutions to assess fair data throughout the research data lifecycle. So let's first have a look at this research data lifecycle. I'm sure you're familiar, and the people in the audience are familiar with the different steps in the research data lifecycle. It starts with planning your research, then you collect your data, you process and you analyze your data. You then start thinking of publishing your paper and sharing the underlying data sets. And then you hand over your published data sets to a repository to preserve the data for the long term. This is preferably done using a trustworthy data repository, as we said, because they match all of the requirements to make this in a professional way and following good community practice. And then the last step of this research data lifecycle is the reuse of the data. So once these data are published, others can come discover them, reproduce your research, or maybe build on your research to discover and generate new knowledge. So throughout this research data lifecycle, FAIR is important. If you want to build fair data, you have to pay attention to the fairness of your data sets at all the levels of this research data lifecycle. Within the FAIR's Fair project, we've looked at different points in this research data lifecycle where fair assessments can be important. So you can see here different scenarios that we envisaged. For example, when you start planning your research and you're writing your data management plan, you would like to know what necessary steps you need to think about, start working on to make your the data you will generate in the future as fair as necessary. Again, as Ingrid said, fair is a continuum. Not all of the data sets you generate need to reach the highest level of fairness, but you need to find the right level of fairness that you need to achieve to respond to your data management plan. You can do also this fair assessment when you're collecting the data to ensure, for example, that you're meeting your target in terms of quality and documentation of the data and so on and so forth. Obviously, at this stage, maybe you don't have a persistent identifier for your data set. So your data sets are not at the highest level of fairness, but that's not important because your data sets are maybe not yet published in the wild world, but they are still within your group, and you don't need to have a persistent identifier, and that is perfectly fine. So you're not reaching the highest level of fairness yet. Other stages of assessments can happen throughout, as I said, this data lifecycle, research data lifecycle. And in the project, we started implementing prototype tools to perform assessments at 2 specific levels. Actually, not exactly assessments, but I will explain a little bit more about that. The first stage is addressed with a tool called FAIR Aware. And again, as you can tell by the name, this is a tool that is has an educational aspect to it, to learn about the FAIR principles and how you can make these, how you can follow these principles in practical terms. And you can use the FAIR Aware tool basically at any stage of the research data lifecycle. But in developing it, we thought about a specific point where you are ready, for example, to deposit your data sets within a repository. But it can be used also earlier, for example, when you're doing the data management plan. The other tool and the other step in the research data lifecycle, as you can see here on the left-hand side of the slide, is after a tool that can be used to assess the fairness of a data object after it was published in a trustworthy repository. And this is through the Fuji, the so-called Fuji tool, fair assessment of, to do fair assessment of published research data sets. So starting with FAIR Aware, we know, and I think you've now had a good understanding after all the presentations, that making, especially Ingrid's presentation, that making data fair involves many challenges, and there are technical challenges and there are social challenges as well. So making data fair depends also on the practices within your discipline, the research norms available within your community, and also your individual skills and capacities, and also the training and education, scientific education you received. So this FAIRware tool is really designed as an educational tool to help educate and raise awareness about FAIR, rather than measuring the fairness of a data object. So it was designed to be practical, to provide you with practical understanding of the FAIR principles and how they can help you to facilitate the reuse of your data sets. And also it was designed to be accessible, easily accessible, because it's available online, and it provides you also with guidance and tips to basically assess your level of awareness. So it's a questionnaire tool, it's a self-testing tool, it is online, and it has guidance and tips, as you will see in a live demo I will run in a minute. And it is also developed as a disciplinary agnostic tool. So it is not linked specifically to any domain. So now quickly, I will run a demo of this tool so you can see, and I hope this will work fine. You can see how this tool works. Claudia, can you confirm that you can see now the FAIRware tool?
Yes, I can see, and I easily found it by typing FAIRware tool, and I found the link. So afterwards, everybody can use it. Teach us all about this, please.
It is findable. This is the first step. Very, very well. So this tool, as I said, presents a questionnaire, a simple questionnaire, which has links to the FAIR project and contact information as well if you need to ask any questions. The first step is identifying who the user is. This is important not necessarily for the users, but for us to collect usage information and to help improve the tool. So I will complete this tool as if I was running this test. So first, you need to define which research domain you are working in. The idea here is that you have a data set in mind or a specific research that will generate data to run the test. So let's say I'm coming from the life sciences. This is actually my scientific background, and biology more specifically, that I am research support, and that I work as an organization for a research infrastructure, as DANCE provides a data repository. So this is really to get a profile of the users. Then we jump straight into the FAIR questions. You can see these are grouped by the 4 letters: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And we have a limited number of questions, 10 questions. If we take, for example, the first question, which relates to obviously one of the FAIR principles, it goes, are you aware that a data set should be assigned a globally unique, persistent, and resolvable identifier when deposited with a data repository? If I understand this question and I'm aware about what it means, I can simply answer yes, and I'm asked a subsidiary question to what degree I will comply with this requirement. So I can indicate, for example, that I'm very likely going to indicate. to comply with this requirement. If I did not understand what this question means, I might answer no, I'm not aware, but I might also click on the info here, the info tip, which will provide me with additional practical information on what is a persistent identifier, example of persistent identifiers, who should assign the persistent identifier. As Ingrid mentioned in her presentation, this is primarily the role of a data repository, and I can even get more information about those persistent identifiers to really improve my awareness and my knowledge and enable me to answer the question here. Likewise, for the other questions regarding findability, for example, here, are you aware that when you deposit a dataset with a repository, you will need to provide some details known as discovery metadata in order to make the data findable, understandable, and reusable to others. Again, as for all questions, you have guidance about the metadata here. And you can see here, for example, that some of the guidance indicates that these issues, for example, data content, actually relate more to reusability in the FAIR principles, but they are still here under findability because we wanted to give this tool an educational perspective rather than a technical perspective. So for example, many of the metadata related issues are grouped under this question instead of having them spread over the different FAIR principles. So I will complete very quickly this assessment just so you can see the next step when I go to the score. Here, I'll just answer randomly these questions. As you can see, I'm pretending I'm not aware of many of the principles and that I have very average willingness to comply. And I'm ignoring the guidance in the interest of time, but you can see that every time I click no, I'm forced basically to read the guidance about this principle. Here, I'll say that I'm very likely. Here also, I'm answering that I'm very likely to answer to comply, and here as well. So once you completed answering these questions based on your knowledge and level of awareness, you're asked to provide also some feedback again to help us improving the tool. Here, I'm going to enter just keywords test so that we can filter out this test from the data we collect on usage. But basically, we ask you what you did not really understand well when it comes to the issues raised by the questions. So this will help us improve the guidance. And also if we are missing something that is important in your discipline or domain. And finally, any other feedback. And what's your feeling about the tool? Did it help you raise your awareness or not? Once you completed this questionnaire, which you can see is not too long and not too complex, you can submit your information, and what you get is an awareness score. So in my case here, I'm moderately FAIR aware. I received a 5 out of 10 score, and my willingness to comply is actually high. And this is what we want actually. We want people to be willing to comply, even if, for example, they're not so much aware about these FAIR principles. And you get also a summary of the guidance to all the questions where you responded that you are not aware, and you can print this as a report for your record. And the data also is kept on our server to basically look at the kind of tests and profiles of people using the tool. So this was for the first part of the FAIR Aware demo. Now I would like to move to the next part. And Claudia, could you just tell me how I'm doing about time? I forgot to start my timer.
That's okay, but I'm controlling it, but we're like in advance in the program.
Okay, but
but don't worry, I'll just cut you off.
Okay, well, I hope to reach the end before you cut me off.
Me too.
So the second part here of my presentation will concentrate on another tool. So this first tool, FAIR Aware, was, as I said, more coming to the issue from an educational perspective and helping you understand the importance of the FAIR or the practical implications rather of the complying with FAIR principles, and also the links with using trustworthy repositories. The second tool I'm going to talk about now is the Fuji tool, which is designed for automatically assessing the fairness of digital objects. And here I need immediately to say that any automated assessment of the fairness of digital objects will depend on machine accessibility and also accessibility of the digital objects. So basically, if a digital object is within a repository that does not allow machine accessibility, automated fair assessment will not be feasible. So let me clarify even further. Within a digital repository, you can have theoretically a relatively a fair digital object or relatively fair digital object, but if that digital object cannot be accessed by machines, the fairness assessment cannot be performed, which does not mean that the digital object is not fair in itself, but that the repository holding that digital object does not allow machines to come and test the digital object. This is really an important notion, so we can really differentiate a fairness assessment from the real fairness of the digital object. So please bear that in mind when I will be going into more explanations about this tool and also the live demo. The Fuji work to develop this tool, the Fuji work started with developing metrics based on the FAIR principles. As Ingrid highlighted in her presentation, the FAIR principles are rather high-level principles. They do not come with the recipe to test the fairness of the digital objects. So the first step was to translate those principles into metrics. And within the project, we've identified 17 what we call viable metrics because they can be tested practically. So we found at least initial solutions to test those metrics in a practical way using machines. And these metrics were published, and you have a link in the slides. We are at version 4 of these 17 metrics. The tool in itself is designed primarily for machine actionability. So for programmers, for managers of repositories to test in a programmatic way the fairness of digital objects. And at the same time, we are also developing a graphical user interface to help user test on a case-by-case basis or even by a bulk upload a number of digital objects individually. So in the machine actionable part, the tool will generate a JSON file which contains the results of the data assessment. In the graphical user interface, what you get is a more human readable report that helps you either as a repository manager or as a user or as a depositor to understand what's the level of fairness of the digital object, which is already published in a repository. So this is the stage where we want the Fuji tool to be used. And I insist that this tool is currently a pilot. It is under development. So everything needs to be taken with a pinch of salt when it comes to the score and the results. And I will give you quickly a demo here so you can see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you have at most 10 minutes. At most.
I will use less than 10 minutes, hopefully. The source code of this tool, Fuji, is open source. It is published on GitHub. You have the link at the bottom of the slide. If you're interested in implementing an instance of this tool, for example, on your repository, or if you would like to test it with a number of data sets you have in a repository, you're welcome to contact us and we will be glad to help you deploy this code and also help us with feedback on the tool to improve it. So let's go into the demo here of this tool. And I will be using the user graphical interface, so the human mediated interface to the Fuji tool rather than the machine API. So this is the pilot for the graphical interface, the web interface of the Fuji tool. As you can see, there's a disclaimer that this is really based on preliminary data and code, that it is still developing. So really take this, again, as I said, with a pinch of salt when it comes to the results. Then you can here see that you can enter a research data object PID, persistent identifier. This is the starting point for the data assessment. If the digital object does not have a persistent identifier or even a URL, then we cannot run the test against its digital object within the repository. So I've selected already a number of digital objects I would like to go and test, so you can see how the tool works. And my first test will be with a digital object I found in the Repositorio de Datos de Investigación de la Universidad de Chile. So as you can see here, this is an institutional repository in a university in Chile. They have currently a number of data sets published, and I've selected this topoclimatic zoning of continental Chile. So if you look at this data set, hopefully it will open. The data is coming from far away, so it takes some time. Here you can see that the digital object identifier is a DOI. So I'm going to just take this digital object, DOI, and perform a Fuji test with this DOI. So I enter the DOI here and I run the test. So the Fuji tool is going to now query the repository in Chile and perform a number of tests and collect information from other resources, DataCite, for example, read3 data, gather a number of data that will be run against a number of tests, which correspond to the 17 metrics, and give me a score. So here I have an information about which resource was evaluated. So this is the DOI. The metric version, this is also important because the metrics will evolve over time. So we have the version that was used, the metric specification where you have a link, you can look at the metric specification, and also the software version because Fuji is evolving. As you can see, we're at version 1.0.6. Here you have a summary of the score. Again, take this with a pinch of salt. This is assessed at a 54% fairness score, and you can see here some details about the FAIR principles that were passed and others that did not, where the tests passed and where the test did not pass. So you can see, for example, that for findable, 6 out of 7 passed, for accessible, 1 only out of 3, for interoperable, 3 out of 4, and for reusable, 3 out of 10. Here you can even go a little bit deeper into the details and see what worked and what didn't work. So for example, data is assigned a globally unique identifier. This test, this practical test, was passed by the digital object in this repository because it has a DOI. I think we could even know from the outset that it would be passed, it would pass because we knew it had a DOI. Data is assigned a persistent identifier, was passed as well. Metadata includes descriptive core elements, creator, title, data identifier, publisher, publication date, summary, and keywords to support data findability. This was passed as well. And you can see the results here, how the machine was able to retrieve the Dublin core metadata here, which was highlighted in green, but also it found more linked data in the form of schema.org metadata through content negotiation, which means that the tool went even outside of this repository to get additional information, which I think in this case came from DataCite. And yeah, as you can see here, it found some additional metadata using DataCite. So there's more information about the resource and more descriptive metadata about the resource. I'll go then into what didn't pass, which test didn't pass. For example, metadata includes the identifier of the data it describes. This is a requirement of the FAIR principles, but apparently this digital object identifier, which is used to identify and locate this data set, is not included in the metadata. So this practical test did not pass. And this can help the repository managers improve these aspects on the repository. So they need basically to include the DOI in the metadata. and also for the users who deposited the dataset to realize that actually the dataset within this repository is not fully compliant with this FAIR requirement. Other examples of tests that didn't pass, for example, metadata contains access level and access condition of the data. This is really important and relates to the question that one of the people asked earlier on how we can access the data, what can be done with the data, so the conditions to access the data, and so on and so forth. So this was not accessible to the machine in this repository, and the test did not pass. I will go then quickly into other examples. For example, the license information here, this is something that did not pass the practical test because the license information, the licensing was not available in the metadata. So basically, if I'm looking at my data set here on the repository, I'm unable to, so this was this one here, this topoclimatic data set. If I look at the terms here, so you can see that even there is a CC0 public domain license, but for some reason, the way it was exposed, and this is really a good example, this is what makes you understand that this scoring needs to be taken really with caution. This license was actually available in the repository, but not made machine readable. So the tool was not able to access it. So it's a question of machine actionability of the licenses, not necessarily of their non-availability. I think I will just take a quick other example here with another example data set from a repository, Pangea, which actually is the repository currently piloting this tool. And this data set relates to a data set in Brazil. And I'm going to copy here the DOI for this data set, which was published on Pangea, which relates to dolphins in Patos Lagoon in Brazil. I don't know if you know about it, Claudia, but I found this on this repository. So if we run a test here, you can see another score here on this repository, which is reaching 83%, not yet 100%. This is very difficult to achieve. I can tell you because many of the metrics currently tested are not yet automatically accessible on repositories, but you can see that at least here, many of the practical tests are passed, but still, for example, this one here has failed, which is about metadata using semantic resources. So here, no vocabulary, no controlled vocabulary or semantic artifact was found which describes the data set. And this is something that the FAIR principles require. So there's still work to be done on this highly curated domain repository, even to improve the fairness of these data sets. So I will stop here, Claudia, with the two demos. I hope these two examples of tools illustrate to the audience what they can do at different level, at different stages of the research data lifecycle to check their compliance with the FAIR principles, and also make it clear, in particular with the Fuji tool, that your choice of repository and the quality and the trustworthiness of the capabilities of the repository will have an important effect on the fairness of the digital object. So choosing a trustworthy repository, as Ingrid said, will provide you with a baseline fairness for your data sets. I think this is the key message I would like people to take from my presentation. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, and I'm sure everybody's going to start trying these tools right after the webinar. And I'd like to call back Rorie, who is going to introduce Maja to us. Okay, so Rorie, microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia. So when we were putting together this session, we realized that obviously the people who might be interested would be very diverse. And so we really wanted to try to have something that would capture the interest of all of those diverse types of people. So not only the real data managers, but also the researchers. You know, if people are connected with funders or publishers. So we wanted to really sort of speak to everyone. And one of the things we did realize is that there may be a number of students, early career researchers, young scientists within the audience as well, who might be interested in this topic and maybe wanted to sort of connect and know a little bit more about research data management. Maybe they're all a budding research data manager themselves, or maybe they have an interest in sort of managing their own data because of their project, and they generate a large amount of data. So this is why we'd like to sort of end the talks with a very short presentation from Maya Dolina, who is co-chair of the World Data System Early Career Researchers and Scientists Network, to sort of give those people an opportunity to maybe see how we are in WDS thinking about future generations and how they might connect with a network of like-minded people. So I will stop talking now and pass over to Maya. So Maya, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So thank you, Claudia and Rorie, for your nice introductions, and hello to everyone from my side as well. I will shortly present to you the Early Career Researchers Network of the World Data System. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, so the network is a group of self-defined early career researchers and scientists who are committed to advancing data stewardship and best practices in data management. And the network aims to connect ECRs across scientific communities and disciplines to foster collaboration and active participation in developing innovative approaches to data integration and sharing. Here you can see who the current co-chairs are. Beside myself, there is Lian Chong and Jessie. So Lian Chong is coming from the Earth Observation Data Center at the Aerospace Information Research Institute, and Jessie is a research service librarian at University Libraries. I myself am involved more in the social sciences data domain. So you can see that we are quite a nice mix of research disciplines within this network. Next slide, please. So what does the network actually do? The members have opportunity to participate in regular webinars and yearly trainings to develop their skills and share their knowledge related to the key areas of research data management. The network also facilitates connections between the members and more experienced global leaders within the World Data System, as well as beyond. As well as regularly profile its members on their quarterly newsletters and other publications. All activities are designed to basically target ECR interests and concern, and are aimed to foster better communication among early career researchers and scientists. Members of the network are also especially encouraged to participate in the WDS Data Stewardship Annual Award that I will present in more detail a bit later. Next slide, please. We have, of course, our website that I encourage you all to visit. It's available at www.worlddataSystem.org/ECR-network. And here you can learn more about us and our activities and see some of our previous reports and presentations. Next slide, please. As already mentioned, we issue newsletters where we advertise new opportunities for our members, as well as describe our various network activities. You can find our previous editions of this newsletter on our webpage. Next slide, please. So recognizing the important role of early career researchers in developing and promoting best practices in data management, data analysis, and data sharing, the World Data System established this network of early career researchers and scientists already in 2017, basically to help foster better communication among ECRs and to design activities targeting their interests and concerns, as I already mentioned. ECRs are supported by the WDS through training opportunities, through blog posts that are targeting ECRs. And as I mentioned already, they are encouraged to participate in the Data Stewardship Award that's being given every year since 2013. Next slide, please. The WDS Data Stewardship Award highlights exceptional contributions to the improvement of scientific data stewardship by early career researchers through their engagement with the community, their academic achievements and innovations. Here you can see the list of some of the recent awardees with Dr. Welty Ethan, who will be presented this award for 2020 and will receive the prize in the forthcoming CDataCon conference 2021. Next slide, please. At the end of this short presentation, I would like to invite you to join our network. You can do so by visiting our website at www.worlddatasystems.org/ECR-network and fill in the registration form, or send us an email at ECR-chairs. So we are open to anyone who is self-defined as an ECR, so early career researcher, and subject only to some minor criteria of membership that we have. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and we are really happy to welcome you to our network. So please join us and see what we can do together. And now I give the floor back to Professor Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for making everybody aware, those who did not already know, of how early career researchers can join this worldwide network around and under WDS. And now I'd like to call everybody to open their cameras and microphones for the last part of questions and answers. And while we're all opening our microphones, I'd just like to say that we do not have any questions right now, except for some questions that remain from the previous question and answer part, but they concern cost as well. And even though cost is of interest to everyone, because it's always a pressing need, I like to cover just a little bit with a question that is always a curiosity from everybody concerning fairness, and the fair, as Ingrid mentioned, sound principles and trust. Okay, so can we trust fair data, even if the repository is not certified? Suppose I take the tests Mohammed showed, and then happily enough, my data are fair. Okay, so can I tell everybody that I have been certified by these tools? Of course, I'm joking. Fairness and trustworthiness. Who could answer a little bit and add whatever you'd like to add, because we are reaching the end and there are no more questions. Does Ingrid want to say something, or Jonathan, Mustafa, Rorie?
Maybe I'll
Dawei. Oh, I'm sorry.
I think I want to distinguish two concepts of trustworthy, like trust data, and then the high quality data. So the high quality data can be like the repository if have a user group really say on collecting fake data. They can make that fake data really good and accessible and has satisfied all the fair the characteristics. But is that trust or not is depend on the users, that what is used that data for. They can use the fake data for research, right? But they may not use the fake data to do the work that require the real data to make some conclusions, for example. So I think there's the fair is more on the usability of the data and they either use or reuse, but the trust or not is really kind of depend on the purpose of people who use data.
Thank you. This is very interesting. And now Ingrid and then Mustafa.
To elaborate a little bit on that concept that Dawei just spoke about, I think it's very important that when we talk about, when you look for high quality data, that there are different aspects to that quality. So in a way, the fair aspect says something about what I like to call the technical quality of the data, whether all the technical elements are in order. But that doesn't say anything about the scientific quality of the data. This has to do, whether the science upon which these data are based, where they come from, is done in the right way. So that has to do with scientific integrity, and the repository isn't capable of judging that. That is really in the hands of the researchers themselves, and and their peers, and the culture at their in their research environment. And I think a third element that plays a role when you talk about whether you use a data set, the quality of the data set, is whether it's fit for the purpose, for the use that you have in your head for that data. So you can have a wonderful 100% fair data set that might not be as fit for purpose for your research than another data set that is maybe only 50%, according to Mustafa's tool, fair, but really fits in your research. And then you will probably use the 50% fair one and not the 100% fair one. So there are different dimensions to that quality aspect and that trust aspect, I think.
Thank you, Mustafa.
Yep, maybe just quickly to add, I think we have to put the trustworthiness concept here back into its context. We're talking about the trustworthiness of the repository and not so much about the trustworthiness of the data set. So when we say a trustworthy data repository, it's a repository we can trust to maintain a data set reusable over time. And as a user, when I get a data set from trustworthy data repository, I can trust that this data set meets a number of technical quality criteria, not necessarily that it has a high level of scientific or its scientific quality is very high. Repositories handle data sets with different level of fairness, and this is completely understandable. So they can have very highly curated data sets where the level of fairness is very high, but for other data sets, this level can be much lower with lower level of fairness. And this doesn't mean that the data sets do not have a value. So I think the trustworthiness and the fairness the fairness needs to be understood at different levels, and the trustworthiness really related to the mission of the repository. Just trying to say this in a different way.
Yeah, thank you. Since there are no more questions, first of all, I'd like to tell the audience that you're still welcome to email questions to eScience@fapesp.br. They will be forwarded to the speakers today, who will answer you by email. And they will also receive all of your questions so they can complement their answers afterwards. I'd like to ask now all of you to say a few famous last words to I shouldn't say that. I hope they become famous to this webinar. Rorie, would you like? I'll go by order of presentations. Rorie.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. We know it was a long session, but we really hope that you've taken something positive out of it. Please do email your questions. Please do register any interest you have in learning more about all of these topics. Again, we've tried to sort of cover the interests of different groups that we believed would be here today. So I really hope we've done that. And beyond that, again, thank you so much to FAPESP and to RDA and to colleagues here for giving up their time to be here today.
It's been a pleasure, and we all, including all of us, learned a lot. Okay, Dawei, please, your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I think Claudia, I agree with your what you said in the opening, that the workshop is about trust, and the trust is about people. I think that all the fairness, the technical things, the repositories is really serve the user community. I think that's what we all care about, and hopefully that the message that we have today and let people understand that in order to have that trust, we need a lot of elements. You know, the community around it, that let people understand why trustworthy is important, why fair is important, and hopefully that with that leverage, and people can use the data to maximize the value for the important uses.
Thank you, John.
So I want to touch just a little bit on that as well, Dawei. We want to trust our scientific research. The whole scientific process through years and years of evolution have worked toward being able to present evidence on your findings so policymakers and the community can trust what you say is true. In many cases, we're making inferences on other populations. We're doing small samples, small tests, and we want to make decisions about larger populations and larger inferences on those larger populations or larger systems in case of the natural systems. And we have to trust the data we use. We have to trust the methodologies we use. All of those things require trust. And I think this community is really keen at not only providing a framework for that trust, but communicating that transparently to not only the researchers on what is required, but also the general community, whether it be policymakers or government agencies or the general public that are consuming the results of these experiments and these data. So I think the whole idea here is present trust and strengthen the scientific research process. And that's what this community is about. And I stress the word community because this is a grassroots effort all the way from the trust paper to core TrustSeal. We're all volunteers that we're here trying to help everyone in this community be more trustworthy and working toward that goal. We're all researchers ourselves and we understand this need. So, and thanks for the opportunity, Claudia.
I thank you so very much for this aspect, because actually one of the cost questions was, who's going to pay for the volunteers who will assess the data? Because we are already volunteers in reviewing papers, right? But we can think about this question afterwards. Ingrid.
So first of all, I'd like to thank FAPESP for the opportunity to organize this workshop today. And what I hope is that what we presented to you, the audience today, really inspires you to think about these aspects, these concepts of trust and fair, and maybe even explore in the future how you could implement parts of that in your own work and in your own working environment, whether you are a researcher or a student or a data manager. Because I think in that way we can, as a community, really contribute to facilitating data sharing and finally also realizing really open science that really adds to the good of everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Ingrid. And as part of this whole thing, we also have to think that we are sharing with the future. So we are contributing to the work of people who may not have been born yet. Okay, and that's really important, in having certified and reliable repositories with fair data and everything. Mustafa.
Thanks, Claudia. I'll echo what my colleague said, thanking FAPESP for this opportunity to talk about, in my case, the fair assessment, fair data assessment, and how it relates to trustworthiness. I think this is really an important topic. And I hope in the audience we had also students, not only researchers and data managers or repository managers, because I think we need also the students to be exposed to these issues and hopefully also trained as part of their education to about the importance of data management and handling data with care and lodging it in trustworthy repositories, because funders can obviously spend a lot of money building the infrastructure, but if researchers are not the ones feeding into and using those infrastructures, we're missing the point. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that front as well, in terms of educating, creating the incentives, making a case for sharing data in trustworthy data repositories. So I hope that those things also are trickling into the education world, so that they make an impact there.
Thank you. Last but not least, Maya, would you like to add your thoughts to this meeting, please?
Yes, thank you. I would also like to thank you for inviting the WDS ECR network to this event. I'm really happy that I was able to present the work that we do within the network. And again, I would like to encourage and kindly invite anyone that's interested in joining the network to do so, and we'll visit our website to find out how we can cooperate together. We would really welcome input from this region of the world, so you're kindly invited to join us.
Thank you, and now I'll finish by sharing my screen again. Okay, now I'll be able to share my screen, because in the beginning, can you see my screen, yes or no? Yeah, okay. I'd just like to point out that all of the slides, we received several questions about, will the slides be available? All of the slides are going to be posted at the event site. And as part of that, I wrote, for documentation's sake, 2 links to documents that were mentioned by the panelists. So they appear in the YouTube and they will be part of the slides. This was our program, and I do think, on behalf of FAPESP, RDA, WDS, and the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, and on my own behalf, all the patience and excellence of all the presentations, Rorie, Dawei, John, Ingrid, Mustafa, Maya, and Rorie again. And please disseminate this webinar and the material, because as you all have seen, this is very important towards ensuring quality of data, trust in data, and fairness. So thank you very much for all of you who presented, all the people who are listening and will listen to us, and to all FAPESP personnel who have supported us from the beginning, including Vera, Roberto, and Mileti. Have a nice day, rest of the day, or maybe it's tomorrow to some people. Goodbye and thank you. And I just like the present to in the room to remain afterwards.